Imagine sitting in a dimly lit room, looking at a monitor displaying a live thermal readout of a human being. You watch their heart rate, their microexpressions, the subtle subconscious shifts in their posture. You think you are studying them, but what if I told you that the monitor isn't showing the person sitting across from you at all? What if the machine is actually projecting an image of your own deepest emotional needs, your own unresolved vulnerabilities, and a completely fabricated script of who you wish that person was? Every single day, millions of highly intelligent people walk into a psychological trap of their own making. We pride ourselves on our intuition, our ability to read the room, and our deep capacity to feel. But there is a silent, systemic error built into human psychology. We don't fall in love with people. We fall in love with our own profiling errors. We take a few sparse data points, a warm smile, a well-timed text message, a shared interest, and our brains immediately manufacture a flawless, cinematic masterpiece of a human being. We dress them up in an identity they never asked for, and then we become profoundly devastated when they fail to play the part. Think about the sheer volume of psychological energy it takes to maintain an illusion. Think about the times you saw a behavioral leak, a sharp comment to a server, an avoidant shift in their eyes when things got real, an inconsistent pattern in their text responses, and your brain instantly went to work, acting as their defense attorney. You didn't see reality, you saw a threat to the fantasy you cultivated. Your brain altered the data to protect the script. When you live inside that loop, you are operating in a state of severe tactical vulnerability. You aren't interacting with the world, you are interacting with a mirror. You are emotionally bankrupting yourself to fund a hallucination. But what happens when the funding runs out? What happens when the sheer weight of reality finally breaks through the cognitive filters? That is the exact moment everything changes. That is the moment the matrix of your own making dissolves, and you are forced to look at the person across from you, not through the lens of your hopes, but through the cold, unyielding light of objective behavioral metrics. It is terrifying. It is liberating, and it is the most critical psychological evolution you will ever undergo. Within the next 10 minutes, I'm going to hand you a psychological skeleton key that will fundamentally alter how you view every relationship, every betrayal, and every connection you will ever make. If you listen closely to what I am about to tell you will save yourself years of emotional bankruptcy, thousands of hours of agonizing confusion, and the catastrophic heartbreak of realizing you gave the best years of your life to a ghost. Most people spend their entire lives trapped in a cycle of emotional projection, constantly wondering why people keep disappointing them. The answer isn't that the world is full of bad actors. The answer is that you are operating with a broken radar. Today, we fix the radar. The human mind is a master counterfeiter. When we meet someone who triggers a spark of attraction or comfort, our brain doesn't just observe them, it actively takes over the narrative. It looks at a completely unwritten canvas and begins painting a masterpiece. We look at an avoidant partner and label them a mysterious soul who just needs to be understood. We look at a volatile personality and call them passionate. We take raw, unrefined behavioral data and we filter it through our own desires until the truth is entirely unrecognizable. The brutal truth. Romanticizing someone is not an act of love. It is an act of psychological manipulation directed at yourself. Why do we do this? Because reality is heavy and fantasy is weightless. It is terrifyingly comfortable to look at someone's potential rather than their present moment execution. When you romanticize a person, you are essentially creating a high-definition avatar of them in your mind. Let's look at the behavioral metrics. Every human being has a baseline, a consistent, predictable pattern of how they speak, how they react under pressure, how they treat people when they have nothing to gain, and how they show up when things get difficult. That baseline is the only reliable data you have. Yet when we are caught in the grip of romanticism, we treat the baseline as an anomaly, and we treat the anomalies as the baseline. If they treat you with cold indifference 4 days out of the week, but send a sweet, validating message on Friday, a romanticizing mind will completely delete the 4 days of data. You will anchor your entire psychological stability onto that single Friday text message. Your brain tells you, see, this is who they really are. No, it isn't. Who they really are is the sum total of their consistent behavior. The Friday text is just noise. The 4 days of indifference is the signal. But when you stop romanticizing people, you stop chasing the noise. You start reading the signal. When you finally stop romanticizing people, a profound shift occurs in your neurology. The cognitive dissonance, that agonizing friction between what you know to be true and what you wish was true, suddenly evaporates. The moment the illusion shatters, it feels like the lights coming up in a theater at the end of a movie. The magic is gone, the music stops, and you see the stains on the carpet and the peeling paint on the walls. It can feel cold. It can feel cynical. You might look at the person you've spent months or years agonizing over and think, how did I ever find them intoxicating? But that coldness isn't a bad thing. It is clarity. It is the feeling of your brain resetting to its default, rational state. When you look at someone without the romantic filter, you finally see them in high definition. You see their flaws, their limitations, their emotional capacity, and their coping mechanisms. You don't judge them, you don't hate them, and you don't try to change them. You simply observe the data. You realize that the narcissist isn't a complex villain in a tragic play. They are just a deeply insecure individual operating on an outdated survival script. You realize the avoidant partner isn't a locked treasure chest waiting for the right key. They are just someone who currently lacks the tools for authentic intimacy. When you strip away the romanticized projection, you stop taking people's behavior personally. If a dog barks, you don't take it as a personal insult. It's just a dog doing what a dog does based on its nature. When you view people through the lens of objective behavioral data, their inability to love you, respect you, or show up for you ceases to be a reflection of your worth. It is simply a statement of their current operational capacity. Stopping the romanticization of others is the ultimate act of self-sovereignty. It means you no longer allow your imagination to hold your peace of mind hostage. You stop falling in love with potential, and you start interacting with reality. From this moment forward, I challenge you to drop the script. Stop editing the people around you to fit a narrative that makes you feel safe. Have the radical, unyielding courage to look at people exactly as they present themselves to you. Read their baseline, track their metrics, value their execution over their promises. Because when you finally stop romanticizing people, you stop living in a world of ghosts, and you finally unlock the power to build connections that are real, unbreakable, and entirely grounded in truth. The human brain is an exquisite, highly evolved prediction engine, but it possesses a critical systemic design flaw. It deeply despises ambiguity. When we encounter another human being who triggers our neurochemistry, whether through physical attraction, a familiar emotional resonance, or a desperate need for validation, the brain does not patiently gather intelligence. It does not sit back, catalog behavioral metrics, and wait for a statistically significant sample size of data to form an objective profile. Instead, it panics at the empty space and immediately initiates a severe profiling error. We call this romanticizing, dressing it up in the poetic language of destiny, soulmates, and instant connections. In reality, it is a clumsy internal heist where your subconscious mind steals a few sparse, fragmented data points and uses them to manufacture a flawless, imaginary operational profile. You look at a person's microexpressions, their curated social presentation, or the specific cadence of their voice, and your brain treats these surface-level anomalies as absolute truth. You're essentially taking a single, well-executed trailer and convincing yourself that the entire 2-hour movie must be a masterpiece. This isn't an emotional virtue or a sign of your deep capacity to love. It is a profound neurological glitch. You completely bypass the critical step of assessing real-world behavioral data. You do not see the way they handle stress, how they treat people who can do nothing for them, or how they navigate accountability. Your mind simply invents the answers to these questions and fills in the blanks with the most flattering colors possible. You assign them a set of core values, a level of integrity, and a capacity for empathy that they have never actually demonstrated in the physical world. This fabricated avatar is then placed directly over the actual human being like a digital filter, completely obscuring the raw, unedited, and often messy reality beneath it. By doing this, you create an immense tactical vulnerability for yourself. You are no longer interacting with the biological entity standing in front of you. You are interacting with a highly sophisticated psychological projection of your own making. You have written a script, cast them in the lead role without their knowledge or consent, and then you become utterly bewildered when they inevitably deviate from the lines you authored. This profiling error is incredibly seductive because it allows us to bypass the slow, sometimes uncomfortable process of truly getting to know someone's baseline behavior. It gives us an immediate hit of certainty and dopamine. We mistake our own intense projection for a profound reciprocal bond. When you operate under the influence of this glitch, you actively filter out any behavioral leaks that threaten the integrity of the illusion. If they display an avoidant shift in posture, a flash of manipulative language, or a pattern of inconsistent communication, your brain's defensive architecture immediately goes to work to protect the fabricated profile. You become their psychological defense attorney, rewriting the data in real time to ensure the fantasy remains intact. You tell yourself they are just tired, stressed, or misunderstood, completely blind to the fact that you are funding a massive cognitive deficit. You are ignoring the cold, unyielding metrics of how they actually show up in reality, sacrificing your own psychological boundaries just to keep the imaginary avatar alive on the screen of your mind. To truly understand why we stay trapped in these cycles, we must look at the cold, mechanistic architecture of human biology, which values survival and energy conservation above all else. The human brain is not a truth seeker, it is a stability seeker. From a purely evolutionary standpoint, reality is incredibly expensive. Processing the fluid, unpredictable, and often contradictory nature of another human being requires an immense amount of metabolic energy. Your brain has to constantly analyze shifting variables, decode microexpressions, weigh conflicting statements, and manage the uncomfortable emotional state of uncertainty. To avoid this massive cognitive tax, the brain takes an aggressive shortcut. It defaults to the malicious comfort of fantasy. A fantasy is entirely static, entirely predictable, and perfectly safe. Inside the matrix of your own imagination, that person never acts outside of their assigned character, never triggers your deepest insecurities unexpectedly, and never forces you to confront the terrifying possibility of rejection or abandonment. Because the brain craves this psychological safety, it constructs an elaborate internal filter designed to actively protect the illusion from the intrusion of real-world data. This is where behavioral profiling becomes an exercise in self-deception. When you are deeply invested in a romanticized narrative, you do not look at red flags as warning signs. your brain perceives them as existential threats to its own comfort. If that person exhibits a blatant behavioral leak, such as a flash of unprovoked contempt, a calculated lie, or a sudden icy withdrawal of affection, the brain experiences an immediate spike of alarm. But the alarm isn't triggered by their bad behavior. It is triggered by the terrifying realization that the fantasy is cracked. To restore homeostasis and return to the comfort of the illusion, your subconscious mind immediately deploys a series of highly sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms. It initiates a process of cognitive filtering, systematically suppressing the negative data and magnifying any tiny, microscopic fragment of positive behavior. If they ignore you for 48 hours and then send a single, low-effort text message, the filtering mechanism completely erases the agonizing 2 days of silence and anchors your entire emotional stability onto that one text. Your brain aggressively rationalizes the discrepancy, convincing you that their distance is merely a byproduct of stress, a difficult childhood, or a demanding workload. You willingly become an accomplice in your own psychological manipulation, actively editing out the raw, unedited footage of their actual execution just to keep the comfortable, fictional script running in your head. This reliance on fantasy creates a dangerous state of tactical blindness. By choosing the safety of a fabricated profile over the messy truth of a flawed individual, you are essentially walking through a minefield with a blindfold that you painted eyes onto. You trick yourself into believing you are safe because the image in your mind is beautiful, entirely ignoring the fact that the ground beneath you is volatile. The longer you inhabit this malicious comfort, the more dependent you become on the illusion, requiring increasingly higher doses of self-delusion to maintain it. You sacrifice your boundaries, ignore your intuition, and dismiss the overwhelming empirical evidence of their actions, all to avoid the temporary, sharp discomfort of admitting that the person you are invested in does not exist. Your brain would rather starve on a beautiful lie than face the demanding, unpredictable labor of digesting an uncomfortable truth. The maintenance of a psychological illusion is not a passive state. It is an active, exhausting, and incredibly expensive internal operation. When you choose to romanticize someone, you are essentially launching a massive cognitive enterprise that requires your brain to work around the clock, burning through vast reserves of emotional and mental energy just to keep the truth at bay. This is the hidden tax of cognitive dissonance, the agonizing, persistent friction that occurs when the empirical reality of a person's behavior flatly contradicts the beautiful, idealized script you wrote for them. In a healthy state of psychological awareness, when a person's actions don't align with your expectations, your brain simply updates its profile based on the new data. But when you are deeply invested in a fantasy, your brain refuses to update the profile. Instead, it attempts the impossible task of altering the reality. Every single time that individual acts out of character, every time they display indifference, coldness, or manipulation, a violent clash occurs within your subconscious mind. To resolve this tension without destroying the illusion, you are forced to step into the role of a full-time psychological defense attorney. You must constantly invent complex, elaborate excuses to explain away their lack of execution. If they cancel plans at the last minute without a valid reason, you spend hours analyzing their past traumas, convincing yourself that their avoidance is merely a defense mechanism from a childhood wound, rather than a simple lack of respect for your time. If they treat you with subtle contempt during a conversation, your mind instantly goes to work rewriting the narrative, telling you that you were being too sensitive, that you misread their tone, or that they are just under an immense amount of pressure at work. This constant process of rationalization and mental gymnastics drains your cognitive battery to a state of near total depletion. You are operating in a perpetual state of hypervigilance, always on the lookout for the next piece of contradictory evidence so you can quickly neutralize it before it shatters your peace of mind. You become completely consumed by the effort of managing the deficit between who they actually are and who you need them to be. This level of psychological expenditure leaves you completely bankrupt in other areas of your life. Your focus drops, your decision-making becomes compromised, and your ability to read other people objectively is completely neutralized because all of your analytical power is being directed inward to fight a losing battle against the truth. You are essentially pouring all of your emotional capital into a fraudulent investment, working overtime to fund a hallucination that yields absolutely zero return. The most insidious part of this dynamic is that the more energy you spend defending the illusion, the harder it becomes to walk away from it. The human mind is highly susceptible to the sunk cost fallacy because you have already sacrificed so much of your peace, your sanity, and your self-respect to maintain this person's fabricated profile. Your brain convinces you that you must keep going, that you must double down on the fantasy until they finally become the person you are pretending they are. You become trapped in a self-inflicted loop of emotional exhaustion, bleeding out your own psychological sovereignty day after day, completely blind to the fact that the only thing keeping the relationship alive is the sheer, unsustainable volume of your own excuses. The collapse of a long-held psychological illusion is rarely a slow, gentle dissolution. It is a sudden, violent, and jarring baseline shift that shatters the mind's defensive architecture in a single, unyielding moment. For months or even years, your brain has been operating at maximum capacity, running complex cognitive algorithms to filter out red flags, rewrite behavioral leaks, and defend an imaginary avatar. But every illusion has a breaking point, a precise threshold where the sheer compounding weight of empirical reality finally punctures the defense mechanisms. This turning point, the exact second you finally stop romanticizing someone, is a profound neurological event. It is the instant the brain stops acting as their defense attorney and suddenly becomes the judge, jury, and executioner. This moment of reality shock doesn't happen because the person across from you did something entirely new. It happens because your brain ran out of the cognitive resources required to keep lying to itself. The dam breaks, the filters dissolve, and the cold, unedited, high-definition truth of who they are floods your consciousness. It is a deeply disorienting sensation, often described as a feeling of sudden, icy sobriety. You look at the exact same face, listen to the exact same tone of voice, and witness the exact same behavioral patterns you have seen 100 times before. But the emotional charge is completely gone. The intoxicating fog of potential has evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the stark, undeniable data of their execution. You see their limitations not as a tragic mystery to be solved, but as a permanent fixture of their psychological makeup. You realize that the individual you spend an agonizing amount of energy trying to save, change, or understand is simply someone who currently lacks the emotional maturity, integrity, or capacity to meet you in reality. This sudden shift can feel incredibly jarring because it forces you to confront a profound sense of grief, not for the loss of the actual person, but for the death of the fantasy you built around them. You are forced to look into the mirror and acknowledge the terrifying extent of your own self-deception. The realization that you were emotionally bankrupting yourself to fund a ghost can cause a temporary wave of intense cynicism and anger. However, beneath the initial shock of the awakening lies the beginning of an immense psychological liberation. When the matrix of your own projection collapses, The agonizing internal friction of cognitive dissonance instantly vanishes. The hypervigilance required to protect the illusion is no longer necessary, allowing your brain to finally drop its guard and return to a state of calm, rational homeostasis. You stop looking at them through the distorted lens of your own unmet needs or childhood vulnerabilities, and you begin to view them with the detached, objective clarity of a behavioral analyst. This is the moment you reclaim your mind from the grip of a self-inflicted hallucination, stepping out of the theater of your imagination and planting your feet firmly on the solid ground of objective truth, fully prepared to see the world exactly as it is. Stripping away the romantic lens and refusing to view people through the distorted filter of your own imagination is not an act of cold cynicism, nor is it a pessimistic retreat from human connection. It is the ultimate act of behavioral sovereignty and raw psychological self-defense. When you make the conscious, deliberate decision to look at human beings exactly as they present themselves, you are reclaiming the executive control of your own mind. You are declaring that your emotional capital is no longer free currency for anyone to exploit through vague promises, fleeting charm, or unfulfilled potential. In a world where most people are hopelessly trapped in loops of projection and emotional desperation, choosing objective clarity is a radical reclamation of personal power. You stop being a passive spectator in your own relationships, waiting around and hoping that someone will magically transform into the idealized avatar you sketched for them in your head. Instead, you become a behavioral analyst of your own life, moving through the world with a razor-sharp radar that values execution over intention and baseline metrics over temporary performance. This shift into behavioral sovereignty completely alters your tactical positioning in every social and romantic dynamic. When you no longer fund a person's illusion with your own excuses, you immediately strip them of their ability to manipulate your reality. If an individual displays an avoidant, manipulative, or inconsistent pattern of behavior, you do not internalize it as a reflection of your worth, nor do you waste valuable cognitive energy trying to decode its hidden, tragic meaning. You simply observe the data point, file it under their operational profile, and adjust your boundaries accordingly. Your boundaries cease to be emotional, reactive walls built out of anger or spite. They become quiet, unyielding, objective structures built on empirical truth. You allow people to hold whatever position in your life their consistent execution warrants, no more and no less. If someone lacks the emotional capacity, integrity, or stability to treat you with respect, you do not hate them or try to fix them. You merely accept their current operational limitations and remove your vulnerabilities from their reach. This protects you from the catastrophic drain of the sunk cost fallacy, ensuring that you never again spend months or years betting on an imaginary future with a person who is actively showing you a bankrupt present. Furthermore, this level of clarity unlocks a profound sense of internal peace. The exhausting, hypervigilant anxiety that defines the romanticized state is replaced by a calm, grounded autonomy. You are no longer riding the emotional roller coaster of waiting for the next anomaly to validate your fantasy, because you are anchored in the steady, predictable reality of the baseline. You grant yourself the ultimate freedom, the freedom to see the world without the exhausting necessity of self-delusion.